All right, we're all set. I'll call our hearing to order, and I'll recognize Nancy for the remainder of your presentation.
Thank you for your forbearance. It's really hard to distill 12 years of work into an hour and a half of comments. A lot happened, and I'm sure many of you can appreciate that in the room. So where I left off was the discussion of what the tribal staff continued to do as the supplemental draft environmental impact statement was being developed. Despite our original hopes, we came to realize as the draft chapters were being written that a lot of what we were raising was still not making it into the analyses, into the chapters. And we weren't really getting a clear picture in many instances of why or why not. When we recognized these deficiencies in the analyses, we took it upon ourselves as best we could. Mind you, there's like a handful of us trying to do this work on behalf of our tribal governments, our tribal communities, to bring our perspectives out more clearly so that the public can be aware of them and consider them as well. So obviously one of the places we started was a cumulative effects analysis using the protocol that EPA underwrote the development of. We took it upon ourselves to try to go through media by media and do an analysis of what the impacts would be across a spatial scale that we felt was really relevant to what the impacts from this project would be, should be. We evaluated obviously cultural resources, but that means the natural resources as well. We looked at land use, water quality, hydrology, mercury, sulfate, on and on and on, and took advantage of a lot of existing data sets, some that we had, some that we knew were readily available from the state agencies, some that we worked on our own to develop. Esteban is going to talk about some of the mapping and analyses he did. He really supported a lot of our work, our geospatial analysis with his skills. And so we provided our own analyses of the impacts, and we provided the data and the references and citations to back them up. But importantly, we were putting it in the context of what was important throughout the ceded territories and across a time scale that we felt was relevant, because there have been impacts that have been cumulative over time. Originally, when we sat down with the Corps early on in the process to talk about what the area of potential effect would be, they agreed that it ought to be it should encompass those upper areas that show up highlighted in yellow, the Partridge and Embarrass River watersheds, but then it should also include at least the riparian areas and follow the whole track of the St. Louis River downstream. That was the earlier proposed APE, area of potential effect. But by the time the supplemental draft impact statement was published, the APE had been shrunk to just the Embarrass and Partridge Rivers because of decisions that had been made along the way, and analyses that the company provided, that the state agencies, the permitting agencies essentially bought, that there would be no impacts beyond the Embarrass and Partridge River watersheds. There wouldn't be any impacts to the St. Louis, so we don't need to even consider them in a cumulative effects analysis. Meanwhile, we tried to provide information in context such as this coverage of what we proposed ought to be considered a tribal historic district. This isn't just the 1854 ceded territories or just the St. Louis River watershed, but it's also an area that is rich in traditional cultural properties. There are trails that are still visible using LIDAR and other techniques. Some of them still used today, in fact, or have become highways and roads today, or rail lines. There were villages, there were sugar bush sites, there were encampments, there were sacred spaces. These were all that we could readily compile and willingly share with the public to demonstrate the density and importance of this whole area that we felt would be affected by this project and the cumulative effects of all of the mining that has gone on and has been permitted to go on. We called attention to the fact that there were already water quality impairments in all of the waters that were draining the site within the Partridge and Embarrass River watersheds. Most of those are mercury impairments. Mercury in the water column, mercury in fish. There's exceedances of the state sulfate criterion. There were aquatic life use impairments. So there's already existing impairments. Another major sulfide mine added on top of that could only increase the effects. We had a PhD candidate that was working with Cliffwick at the time who got into the state's water quality data and did an analysis, a spatial analysis of sulfate data and specific conductance data to answer that question about how far downstream do these elevated constituents, are they measurable? And again, mind you, this was data that was either collected by the state or by permittees, that is quality assured, that is in their database, that is readily accessible. And it was clear that for both sulfate and specific conductance, that first of all, we know where the sources are. They have been mapped. And we know from some of the work that was done using stable isotopes where they were originating. And in fact, you can measure elevated sulfate and specific conductance, as I said before, all the way downstream, past the reservation, all the way down into the St. Louis River estuary or area of concern. What we didn't see considered in any of the analyses, particularly for downstream effects, is that the riparian wetlands that are connected to our stretch of the St. Louis River are pretty extensive, and they're mapped here. And every time we see a cycle of high flows, like right now, it's raging. The hydrograph is off the charts with snowmelt and the heavy rains that we've received. And then you've got the opposite, like last October, where it's just base flow. You see that drawing down and re-wetting and drawing down and re-wetting with that load of sulfate adding to the system, adding to the mercury that's being washed off. You have a perfect methylating environment. None of that was considered in the mercury analysis or the cumulative effects analysis. And so the experts coming after me are going to dig into that pretty deeply. So finally, the supplemental draft EIS was published in 2013. The project had changed pretty considerably. There were a lot of new features, things that were not part of the original project that were added, intended to minimize some of the predicted ecological and environmental impacts. There were some liners and caps. They were going to backfill a lot of the waste rock into the east and central pits, and they were proposing to do some mechanical wastewater treatment, including reverse osmosis. And the goal was to be able to transition after closure to a maintenance-free scenario, when in fact it was pretty clear that the amount of pollutants that would remain in the pit water and coming off of the site were going to require management and mechanical treatment far into the future, as far as we could model. We felt that the impact analyses were in many cases still really deficient, especially as they reflected upon impacts to treaty resources. And again, the tribal analyses that we had done, that we had shared, that we had brought to the table for discussion were relegated to essentially a really brief bulleted chapter, Chapter 8, Major Differences of Opinion, and our cumulative effects analysis and some of Gliffwick's work on hydrology were relegated to an appendix. So again, instead of being presented as alternative analyses, alternative predictions of impacts so that the public could read and consider and at least be aware of. We were considered something less than the formal environmental analysis, something that was not worth the consideration, excuse me, of the co-lead agencies. These were not minor disagreements. These are fundamental differences of our predictions on how this project would impact the environment across every media imaginable and across time scales that bordered into perpetuity. And yet this is what the co-lead agencies released to the public. We participated in several open meetings, provided our own posters and tabling and fact sheets and information, provided a lot of Q&A sessions to people that wanted to hear what the tribes had to say. But again, it didn't make it into the formal SDEIS. There were, I think, 3,000 comments on the draft environmental impact statement and somewhere north of 50 or 60,000 comments received on the supplemental draft impact statement. So there was some time afterwards, after the public comment period closed. And while that was happening, while the co-lead agencies were reviewing the comments received and thinking about how to respond to them, we continued to do our work. We still felt like there had been insufficient attention paid to some really fundamental processes that, if this project was going to be moving forward, absolutely needed to be addressed in permitting. In fact, a lot of the things that we were red flagging along the way, the agencies said, we're not going to deal with those now. We'll wait and deal with them during permitting. So some of the work that we undertook had to do with, I mentioned our concerns about the socioeconomic analysis being really biased towards jobs only. So we contracted for an ecosystem services valuation of the St. Louis River watershed so that we could begin to quantify some of the services that a healthy, intact watershed could provide not only the band, but all of us. We continued to do some work on groundwater modeling with assistance from USGS. And we relied upon an expert review of the seepage capture report that essentially affirmed our concerns about the inability to really capture the seepage of really highly polluted tailings water as proposed. Some of the work that was done at this time and since has included a more, I believe, accurate depiction of what the groundwater drawdown would be from this project. I mean, right here in the blue, those are the east, west, and central pits at closure. So that's their footprint. And it's essentially this area and immediately adjacent to it that was what the 900 acres that were permitted as direct impacts under this 404 permit. But the drawdown at closure, when you have pits that are 600 feet deep, the hydrologic modeling that has been done since then essentially demonstrates that there's quite a radius of impacts that extends quite a ways out, and that there is reasonably easily foreseeable and predictable impacts to wetland condition, function, type, etc. And not to mention some of the other landscape processes that are affected by hydrology. Our ecosystem services valuation, as I said, was intended to begin to quantify what some of these important functions are in this big watershed. And we really, we had no budget to go after any independent studies. We relied upon an extensive reference library that Earth Economics maintains on similar studies. And so we just looked at really broad ecosystem types and land use types and did calculations that established ranges, a high and a low value for what the amount of acreage of each of those land use types would be. And so we end up with an annualized value of somewhere between $5 and $14 billion just in the simple ecological services provided by these basic landscape types. We also looked at what carbon storage would mean in the various landscape types. You remember I mentioned earlier our concerns for the simplicity of the climate change impacts analysis, not recognizing that it isn't just about the emissions that the vehicles put out, but it's also about what we have lost in terms of thousands of acres of carbon storage. And so if you combine those two and prorate it across 20 years, so a generation essentially, the asset value of the St. Louis River watershed conservatively is between $275 and $689 billion. And again, this is really lowballing it. We only looked at a few select landscape types. Some of the hydrologic modeling that we continued to do took into account the known impacts of the concurrent mining and pit drawdown that was going to be happening at the Peter Mitchell pit, which is just several miles away from the mine site. And what we were able to demonstrate, essentially John Coleman's modeling from Glyphwick, was that the head change would, instead of causing most of the groundwater flow from the pits at closure to flow southward into the Partridge River, which was what the project proponents were saying their model showed, that in fact it was going to be drawn northwards towards the Peter Mitchell pits and into the Rainy River watershed, which includes the boundary waters. Now, this is a fundamental difference in what post-closure groundwater hydrology is going to be. And this fundamental difference was something that we brought to the attention of the co-lead agencies. Took time to get into the nitty-gritty of how the model was developed to produce these results and what it meant. And we hoped that this might at least press pause on the finalization of the environmental review on the record of decision. But I'd leave this for you to ponder just a moment, because this really encapsulates our experience as a cooperating agency, trying to bring sound science and a more holistic review of impacts to bear, even when the co-lead agencies recognized that this analysis was probably correct. They were not going to deal with it at this point. They were going to move forward, and they were going to rely upon adaptive management to deal with whatever problems might occur. Now, mind you, one of the arguments that the project proponent had that this was not going to be a problem was that a groundwater mound would form in that area of the Partridge River watershed between the PolyMet pits and the North Shore Peter Mitchell pit. And that groundwater mound would prevent water from flowing northward. That does not comport with any of the laws of physics as our consultants at USGS have come to utilize. And it was really something that we were aghast and appalled that the co-lead agencies were willing to accept, but they were ready to move on. At this point, we've spent upwards of 8 years, 7 or 8 years in environmental review, and it's time to move on to permitting. We felt strongly enough about the importance of getting this right now that we did a last-ditch effort and appealed to the 3 federal agencies involved, the EPA, the Army Corps, the Forest Service. We asked one of these federal agencies to elevate this discrepancy to the CEQ before the EIS would be finalized. We were not eligible, we were not in a position where we could do that. It could only be done by one of the federal agencies involved. And none of them agreed that it was important enough to resolve now. It did not need to go to CEQ. It was time to wrap up environmental review and move on to permitting. They also declined to include in the final EIS any of the additional analyses that the tribes had done during the time between the SDEIS being published and the final EIS being published. They were only going to include information that had been available through the SDEIS. The Forest Service was the first to issue their record of decision and their final EIS. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than to say that we have objected. We did object to the issuance of the record of decision and actually the approval for the land exchange. We thought that at the very least, it could wait to be finalized until permits were in hand. But the Forest Service declined. And mind you, there were a whole raft of issues that we brought to the regional forester in consultation about why we were objecting. But at the end of the day, it's important to note that the land exchange meant that about 6,000 acres of really high quality, relatively pristine, intact, contiguous acres of habitat, wetlands, were going to be taken out of the public domain, out of the access that the tribe has for treaty resource harvest. And what was being replaced in the land exchange were a number of scattered parcels. They did manage to find them all within the 1854 ceded territories, and that was because we had made a point of elevating this. Some of the earlier offerings included lands outside of the ceded territories, but at least these were all within the boundaries. But there's nothing about this scattered series of inholdings that provides the same kind of quality, habitat, and resource values that the lands that were exchanged provide. So the permitting began. We felt there were a whole lot of unresolved EIS issues that, as I said, were supposed to be dealt with during permitting. But from our perspective, we're still not being resolved. Adaptive management is a term that was used across the board. I don't have anything fundamentally against the notion of adaptive management if it means something along the lines of continuous improvement. If you can find new and better ways of doing things that are less destructive or damaging to the environment. But this is, in the context here, adaptive management meant that even though we could reasonably, foreseeably predict certain things were going to happen, we'll deal with them when they happen, when the horse is out of the barn. And I don't know that anybody can make a good argument that that is the most responsible way to deal with known environmental impacts. We noted some really disturbing and distressing permitting irregularities associated with the NPDES permit and the interaction between the EPA and under the Trump administration and the MPCA. That's to be dealt with in another day in another court. But I would say that what was really distressing and is entirely relevant today is that on 3 separate occasions, the Fond du Lac Band sent written communications to the Army Corps leadership and to the EPA regional administrator. After the FEIS was done and permitting was taking place, but before the 404 permit was actually issued. And we asked that a 401A2 letter be sent to the band so that we would have this opportunity to share with the permitting agencies before the fact our concerns for impacts to downstream water resources on the reservation. 3 separate letters. And I believe the Corps responded that they received them. We didn't even get the courtesy of that response from the EPA regional administrator. Mind you, in the previous 8 years, Region 5 had supported the tribal staff with technical support, with training, with some resources and development of guidance. You know, they could do things up to a point to help us build capacity to engage at this level in what we hoped would be a meaningful fashion early in the process, at a time when our concerns could be considered and a project plan could be improved or changed to ensure that tribal resources were considered and protected. But that did not happen. And then as we were seeing the permits emerge, the draft permits emerge, again, there were no numeric limits in particularly the water quality permit. And it was really, really hard for us to understand how the state could be satisfied with a permit that had no enforceable limits. So we find ourselves at a point here at the end of the final EIS and records of decisions being published and permits, draft permits going out for review and being finalized. Hundreds, if not thousands of pages of comments, consultation, our best attempt at bringing well-founded scientific analysis to the table, and our trust and confidence in the regulatory framework that we thought existed. And ultimately the trust responsibility that we believe that the federal agencies needed to honor and implement through this process. We ended up with a project that we felt we could not walk away and throw up our hands in despair, that we needed to continue to fight to be heard. And so we turned to the courts, and we have challenged a number of the decisions that have been made: the land exchange, the dam safety permit, the permit to mine, 401 cert and the 404 permit, obviously, the 402 permit, the air quality permit. These are all in court right now. We're stretched pretty thin, trying to make sure that the band's perspectives are fully considered at this point in time. But I have to say that overall, these last 10, 12 years have felt a lot like our efforts have just been swept under the rug. And that's not good for any of us. It isn't just that the tribes are trying to look out for themselves. I think that in the work that we did to shine a light on what we thought were fundamental flaws and discrepancies were things that the community as a whole would find important, that the co-lead agencies and the permitting agencies would take to heart as their fundamental responsibilities. But I don't think that at this point in time that we can say that that has happened. I think today, what we are doing right now is a beginning of a recognition of how the band's regulatory authorities and legal standing and treaty rights ought to be considered and listened to and heard. And I hope that that is what we all take away from today and these next couple of days as we hear about some of the things that maybe haven't been heard about all in one place at one time. Miigwech.
Thank you, Nancy, for that very thorough and great presentation.